The rain didn't fall. It assaulted the earth. I sat in my Jeep, engine idling, watching the bridge downstream crumble into the swelling river. Trapped. The intercom at the massive iron gates crackled, then buzzed open without a word. I drove through the mud, tires spinning, until I reached the portico. She was standing there, Sydney, unflinching in the face of the gale, holding a glass of wine like a weapon. I tumbled out, shouting over the wind about the bridge, about the roads. She didn't blink. "The roads are gone," she said, her voice cutting through the thunder. "Stay, but not as a guest. Stay as my muse, until the rain stops." The heavy oak door slammed shut, sealing the storm away. I am a creature of data. I track pressure gradients, humidity levels, the precise mathematics of disaster. I had come to this valley because the microclimate here is an anomaly, a pocket of turbulence that defies the regional models. I expected solitude. I expected to set up my instruments, drink bad coffee, and wait for the numbers to align. I did not expect the silence of this house. It wasn't empty silence. It was heavy, curated, like the breath held before a conductor lifts a baton. The villa was a fortress of stone and dark wood, smelling of centuries of wood smoke and the vanilla almond scent of decaying paper. My boots squeaked on the marble floor, a wet, intrusive sound that made me wince. I felt like a contaminant. "You're dripping on the Persian rug," she noted. Sydney Warner. The name on the spine of the novels that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She was smaller than I expected, but she took up all the space in the room. She wore a silk blouse that seemed impractical for a storm, gray trousers, and no shoes. Her eyes were dark, assessing, stripping away the layers of my rain gear and my professional defenses with a single sweep. "I'm a climate scientist," I said, the words feeling clumsy. "My equipment is in the Jeep. I just need a phone." "Lines are down," she said. "Cell towers too. You know this. You study storms." She moved around me, circling like a predator inspecting a new addition to the territory. I stood frozen, water pooling around my feet. I'm used to observing. I watch the radar, I watch the sky. I am never the thing being watched. But under Sydney's gaze, I felt like a specimen pinned to a board. She wasn't looking at me with hospitality. She was looking at me with intent. It was unnerving. It was electric. "You have a scientist posture," she observed, stopping in front of me. "Rigid. Brace for impact. You treat the air around you like it's something to be measured." "It is," I replied. "Everything is measurable." "Not everything," she countered softly. The air in the house felt pressurized, distinct from the low-pressure system raging outside. It was a different kind of storm, one made of tension and unspoken intent. I looked at the rows of books, the heavy furniture, the fire crackling in the massive hearth. This was her world. I was just a variable she hadn't accounted for, or perhaps exactly the variable she had been waiting for. "Why a muse?" I asked, the question escaping before I could filter it. "I'm here for data, not inspiration." "They are the same thing," she said. "You look for patterns in the chaos. So do I. I've been staring at a blank page for 6 months. The storm brought you to my door. I don't believe in accidents, Doctor. I believe in narrative structure." She stepped closer, invading my personal space with a casual arrogance that made my heart hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could smell her perfume, sandalwood, and something sharper, like ink. "You can stay," she continued. "You can set up your little machines, but you belong to the house now, to the story." My scientific mind screamed to leave, to sleep in the Jeep, to take my chances with the washed-out bridge. But my body betrayed me. I felt a gravitational pull toward her, undeniable and terrifying. It was the thrill of standing on a cliff edge, the sudden drop in pressure before the lightning strikes. "Here," she said, extending a hand. She held a thick white towel. "Dry off, then whine. We have a lot of work to do." I took the towel. Her fingers grazed mine, a brief, burning contact that lingered long after she pulled away. The fire was a roaring, breathing thing, consuming logs the size of my thigh. I sat on the edge of the hearth, the heat prickling against my damp skin, holding the glass of wine Sydney had pressed into my hand. It was a dark, heavy red, tasting of earth and history. A stark contrast to the sterile, metallic taste of the adrenaline still coating the back of my throat. Outside, the wind slammed against the stone walls. A frustrated beast denied entry. But in here, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the steady, rhythmic sound of Sydney pacing behind me. I had opened my laptop, the screen glowing blue in the dim light, displaying the radar loops I'd managed to cache before the signal died. The storm cell was a bruised purple mass on the screen, rotating with a violence that made my professional brain itch with curiosity. I was tracing the pressure gradient with my fingertip, lost in the math of it, when Sydney's shadow fell over the keyboard. "You look at that screen like it's a lover," she said. Her voice was closer than I expected. I didn't look up immediately. "It's a supercell. The updraft is defying the local topography. It shouldn't be sustaining this level of intensity. And yet it is," she murmured. She came around the sofa and sat on the opposite end of the hearth. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was watching my hands. 6 months. I finally looked at her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Not physical tiredness, but a deep, spiritual fatigue. 6 months? Since I wrote a sentence that felt true, she confessed. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. The critics call it a hiatus. My publisher calls it a sabbatical. I call it silence. The characters stopped talking. The world stopped making sense. I came here to force the issue, to lock myself away until the noise returned. But all I found was the rain. She took a sip of her wine, her gaze never leaving mine. It was unflinching, a laser focus that made me want to pull my jacket tighter around myself. "Then you arrived," she continued, "with your mud and your machines and your absolute certainty that the chaos can be measured. You don't look at the storm and see a metaphor for grief or rage. You see data. You see physics. It makes it manageable," I said defensively. "If you can measure it, you can predict it." "Exactly." She leaned forward, the distance between us shrinking, the air charged, thickening with a sudden, palpable tension. "That is what I need. I need your grounding. I need to watch someone who isn't lost." I frowned, setting my wine glass down on the stone. "You want to watch me work?" "I want to borrow your gravity," she corrected. "Here's the proposition, Doctor. The bridge is out. You are stranded. You need power for your equipment and a roof over your head. I have a generator and a library. You can stay. You can turn my home into your laboratory. You can track your storm until it dissipates." "And in exchange?" I asked, though I already felt the trap snapping shut. "In exchange, you let me look," she said. Her voice dropped, becoming serious, transactional. "You don't pose, you don't perform. You just exist. You do your work, and you let me observe the way you do it. You let me describe the way your jaw tightens when the data doesn't line up. You let me write down the way your hands move. You be the anchor, and I'll build the story around you." My instincts screamed that this was dangerous. There was a predatory edge to her offer. I should have refused. I should have slept in the Jeep and hiked out the moment the rain let up. But the pull was visceral. It was the same magnetism that drew me to the center of storms, the need to be close to the source of the power. "A contract," I said slowly. "Of attention." "A symbiosis," she countered. She extended her hand again, not to offer a towel this time, but to seal the agreement. "Stay until the rain stops. Be my muse." I looked at her hand. Long fingers, ink-stained at the cuticle, steady. I reached out. When our palms touched, the contact was shocking, a static discharge that had nothing to do with the weather. Her grip was firm, warm, and terrifyingly possessive. "Deal," I whispered. She didn't let go immediately. She held my hand for a second too long, her thumb brushing over my knuckles, testing the bone structure beneath the skin, as if she were already writing the description of this exact moment. Then she released me, and the loss of contact felt like a sudden drop in temperature. "Good," she said, standing up and moving toward the library. "Start working. I have a pen to find." The morning didn't break. It merely bruised the sky a lighter shade of charcoal. The rain had settled into a relentless, drumming rhythm against the slate roof, a sound that should have been soothing, but instead felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. I found Sydney in the library, a cavernous room where the walls were lined with leather-bound spines and the air was thick with the dust of old ideas. She had cleared a space at the end of a massive mahogany table, her territory marked by a stack of pristine cream paper and a bottle of black ink that looked dangerously like poison. I set up my station at the opposite end. My laptop, my satellite uplink unit, my tangle of charging cables, modern plastic utilitarian debris scattered across the ancient wood. It felt like a desecration. I opened the latest packet of data from the coastal buoy. The numbers were bad. The low-pressure system had stalled, churning over the coast, feeding on the warm water and refusing to move. It was a weather event of catastrophic potential, the kind of data set that usually consumed my entire brain. But I couldn't focus. The only sound in the room, louder than the rain, louder than the hum of my hard drive, was the scratching of Sydney's fountain pen. It was a rhythmic, abrasive sound. Scritch, scratch, pause. The pause was the worst part. The pause meant she was looking. I didn't need to look up to know her eyes were on me. I could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical touch, a change in air pressure against my skin. It started at my hands, hovering over the way my fingers moved across the trackpad, then traveled up my wrists, lingering on the pulse point that I knew was beating too fast. It crawled up my neck, a slow, deliberate inspection that made the fine hairs there stand on end. I shifted in my chair, crossing my legs, trying to make myself smaller, trying to shield the data of my own body from her analysis. The moment I moved, the pen started again. Scritch, scratch. Fast, furious. As if she were rushing to capture the motion before it evaporated. She wasn't writing a novel. She was transcribing me. I endured it for an hour. I watched the storm surge models on my screen blur into meaningless colors. I was being dismantled, observation by observation. The power dynamic was intolerable. I was the specimen in the jar. She was the one tapping the glass. I stopped typing. The silence that followed was abrupt. Sydney's pen stopped a second later. "You're staring," I said, keeping my eyes on my screen. "I'm observing," she corrected, her voice smooth, unrepentant. "You're writing about me." I finally turned my head. She was leaning back in her chair, the pen resting loosely in her fingers, her expression one of calm, predatory satisfaction. "That wasn't the deal. You said you needed an anchor. You didn't say I was the subject." "I said I needed to watch someone who wasn't lost," she reminded me. "I'm not writing about you, doctor. I'm writing the texture of your concentration. There is a difference." "Is there?" I challenged. "Read it." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something. Amusement, vulnerability, crossed her face. Then she lifted the sheet of paper. She didn't clear her throat or prepare. She just read, her voice dropping an octave, turning the words into something that felt like a caress. "She treats the silence like an adversary," Sydney read, her eyes locking onto mine. "Her posture is a study in resistance, spine rigid, shoulders braced, as if she expects the roof to cave in. But it's her hands that betray her. Every time the numbers on her screen turn red, she tucks a strand of hair behind her left ear. A nervous tick, a reset button. She does it with a violence that suggests she wishes she could rearrange the world as easily as she rearranges herself." The air in the room vanished. My hand was halfway to my ear, reaching to tuck back a stray lock of hair. I froze, my fingers hovering near my temple, caught in the exact act she had just described. I lowered my hand slowly, feeling the heat climb up my neck, a flush that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was accurate. It was devastatingly precise. It was intimate in a way that felt like a violation. Yet the sensation blooming in my chest wasn't anger. It was recognition. She saw me. She wasn't just looking at the surface. She was mapping the internal mechanics of my anxiety. "You missed one thing," I managed to say, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted. "Oh?" She raised an eyebrow, the pen hovering over the paper again, ready to strike. "I don't wish I could rearrange the world," I said. "I wish I could stop it from breaking." Sydney watched me for a long beat, her dark eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she lowered the pen to the paper. "Hold that thought," she whispered. The scratching resumed, but the silence between us had shifted. It was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers sharing a room. It was charged, heavy with the electricity of a storm that had moved indoors, waiting for the first strike of lightning. The grid finally surrendered to the gale at 8:04 p.m. I noted the time automatically, a reflex of my profession, even as the villa plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight dropping onto my chest. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the heating vents, the distant buzz of my server, everything vanished, leaving only the roar of the wind battering the stone walls and the frantic, rhythmic lashing of rain against the glass. We migrated to the hearth not out of romance, but out of necessity. The temperature in the large, high-ceilinged rooms began to drop immediately, the damp cold of the valley seeping through the limestone. Sydney built the fire up until it was a roaring beast, casting long, dancing shadows that climbed the walls and flickered across the spines of her thousands of books. We sat on the Persian rug, the one I'd dripped on earlier. The distance between us, which had been a vast, defensive ocean in the library, had shrunk to the width of a single cushion. I held my wine glass, the second of the night, and watched the flames reflect in the dark liquid. I could feel her watching me again. Not with the pen this time, but with that same unnerving, dissecting intensity.
"Why do you run toward it?" she asked.
Her voice was low, pitched to slide under the sound of the thunder. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. The data requires proximity. "Don't give me the grant proposal answer," she said, shifting slightly. The movement brought her knee within inches of my thigh. The heat radiating from the fire was intense, but the heat coming off her, or perhaps the heat blooming in my own blood, was sharper. Normal people run away from disaster. You drive a jeep into the throat of it. That's not science, doctor. That's a pathology. I swirled the wine, watching the vortex form in the glass. It's the noise, I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could check it. The world is loud. People, expectations, the constant static of living. But inside a supercell, when you get past the debris field and the violence, there is a 0 point, the I. It is the only place on earth where the silence is perfect. I go there because it's the only place I can think. Sydney went still. The firelight caught the hollow of her throat, the sharp line of her jaw. She looked less like a famous author in that moment, and more like a woman who knew exactly what it meant to be deafened by the world. "And you?" I turned the question on her, bold in the dim light. "You sit in this fortress and invent problems for imaginary people. Why?" "Control," she answered without hesitation. She reached out to place another log on the fire, her movement fluid and deliberate. Real life is messy. It has no structure, no narrative arc, no guarantee of resolution. It's just chaos. But on the page, I am the god of that small universe. I decide who loves, who leaves, and who survives the storm. I write to force the chaos into a shape I can stand to look at. She turned back to me, and the air between us suddenly felt thick, viscous with unsaid things. The fire popped, a sharp crack that made me jump, but Sydney didn't flinch. She just held my gaze. In the flickering amber light, her eyes were dark pools, bottomless and terrifyingly inviting. "We are opposites then," she murmured. "You chase the chaos to find the quiet. I use the quiet to orchestrate the chaos." "Maybe not opposites," I whispered. "Maybe counterparts." The distance on the rug seemed to collapse further, though neither of us had moved. I was hyper-aware of the line of her body, the way the silk of her blouse draped over her shoulder, the way her breathing had synchronized with mine. The storm outside felt 1,000,000 miles away. The real danger was right here, sitting cross-legged in the firelight, looking at me as if I were the first true sentence she'd heard in years. The fire slowly burned down to embers, the bright flames dying into a deep, pulsing red glow. The shadows in the room lengthened, swallowing the furniture, the books, the world beyond the rug. We sat in the heavy darkness, the silence no longer empty, but charged, waiting for a spark that had nothing to do with the wood in the grate. The storm had lost its temper and found its rhythm. The manic violence of the previous night had smoothed out into a monotonous, slate-gray endurance, the rain falling in heavy, vertical sheets that turned the world beyond the windows into a watercolor smear. I woke up with the strange, disoriented heaviness that comes from sleeping in a bed that isn't yours, in a house that feels like it's breathing around you. The villa was quiet again, but it was a different frequency of silence, less ominous, more domestic. It was the silence of damp wool and cooling embers. I found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee. It was a sleek, industrial space of brushed steel and dark marble, a stark contrast to the Gothic weight of the library. It felt like the engine room of the house. Sydney was already there. She was leaning against the butcher block island, staring out at the rain-lashed garden, holding a ceramic mug with both hands. She wore a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, tied loosely at the waist, revealing the sharp line of her collarbone. Her hair was loose, a dark cascade down her back, unstyled and wilder than the severe persona she presented yesterday. "Black," she said without turning around. "The beans are on the counter. The grinder is loud. I apologize in advance." "I'm used to loud," I said, my voice raspy with sleep. I moved toward the coffee station, acutely aware of the limited square footage between the island and the cabinets. We moved around each other like satellites with malfunctioning navigation systems. It was a clumsy, high-stakes choreography. I reached for the grinder, she reached for a spoon. I stepped back to open the fridge, she stepped forward to rinse a saucer. In the vastness of the villa, we were somehow compressed into this singular 4-foot radius of heated air. Every movement felt calculated, every pass a near miss that sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. I told myself it was just spatial awkwardness, the friction of two solitary creatures forced to share a habitat. Then came the collision. It was innocuous, a simple error in trajectory. I reached for the carafe of the French press at the exact moment she reached to push it toward me. Our hands didn't just bump, they tangled. My fingers brushed against the back of her hand, sliding over the knuckles, the contact firm and prolonged. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. It wasn't a spark. Sparks are small, fleeting things. This was a circuit closing. I felt the heat of her skin transfer to mine with a speed that defied thermodynamics. A sudden, searing jolt that traveled up my arm and detonated somewhere behind my ribcage. I froze. My scientific brain, usually so good at categorizing stimuli, stuttered. This wasn't data I could plot on a graph. This was a thermal event. I expected her to pull away. That is the social contract of accidental touch. You recoil, you apologize, you reestablish the perimeter. Sydney didn't move. She didn't pull her hand back. Instead, she turned her head, slowly, her dark eyes locking onto mine with that same terrifying analytical intensity from the library. She looked at our hands, my fingers resting on her skin, her hand gripping the glass handle. And then she looked at my face. She was testing the tension, measuring the voltage running between us. She was writing the scene in real time, gauging exactly how long I would hold my breath before I broke. "Your hands are cold," she observed. Her voice was low, a rough velvet texture that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "Circulation issue," I managed to say, though the heat flooding my face suggested otherwise. "The house is drafty." "The house is a fortress," she corrected. She shifted her weight, leaning imperceptibly closer, pressing into the contact rather than retreating from it. "Maybe you're just not used to the heat." For a second, the air in the kitchen was too thin to breathe. The smell of the coffee was overwhelming, rich and bitter. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. I wanted to pull away, to retreat to my safe, sterile world of numbers and radar loops, but my hand refused to obey. I wanted to trace the tendon in her wrist. I wanted to know if the rest of her skin burned with that same impossible temperature. Then the spell broke. The refrigerator compressor kicked on with a loud hum, shattering the silence. I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned, spilling a few drops of hot water onto the marble. "Sorry," I muttered, grabbing a towel, retreating to the far side of the island. "I'm not fully awake." "Clearly," Sydney said. She picked up the French press, her movements fluid and unbothered, and poured the coffee into a second mug. She slid it across the marble toward me. The sound of the ceramic scraping against the stone was loud, definitive. "Drink up, doctor. The storm isn't going anywhere, and neither are we." She picked up her own mug and walked out of the kitchen, trailing the scent of sandalwood and the heavy, electric memory of her touch. I stood there, gripping the warm porcelain, my heart rate monitor, if I'd been wearing one, undoubtedly flashing a warning red. I looked at the spot on her hand where I'd touched her, half expecting to see a burn mark on the air itself. The rain hammered against the glass, relentless and isolating. But the real danger was no longer outside. It was walking down the hallway, drinking coffee, and waiting for me to break. The cold had settled into my marrow, a persistent, damp ache that had nothing to do with the temperature of the villa and everything to do with the way Sydney looked at me. I needed to reset. I needed a variable I could control. I retreated to the bathroom, a sanctuary of dark slate and polished chrome that felt less like a domestic space and more like a geological formation. The tub was a monolith, carved from a single block of volcanic basalt, deep enough to drown in. I turned the tap as far as it would go, letting the water roar into the basin, scalding and fierce. I sank into the heat. The relief was instantaneous, a physical unraveling of the knots that had tightened along my spine since I drove through the gates. I closed my eyes. The steam rose in thick, opaque clouds, filling the room, softening the hard edges of the slate, erasing the world. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt hidden. I was just a body in water, no longer a subject, no longer a muse, no longer a data point to be transcribed. The fog was a whiteout, a perfect, blinding, zero visibility event. Then the door clicked. It wasn't a slam. It was the soft, deliberate engagement of a latch. I froze, sinking lower until the water lapped at my chin. Through the dense, swirling fog, I saw a silhouette detach itself from the doorway. Sydney. She shouldn't be here. The bathroom is the one place where the contract of observation should be suspended, but Sydney didn't operate by the laws of social physics. "You forgot a towel," she said. Her voice was different in here, amplified by the tile, dampened by the steam. It was everywhere at once, wrapping around me like the humidity. I was going to drip dry, I deflected, my heart hammering against the stone rim of the tub. I didn't want to ruin another Persian rug. "Inefficient," she countered. She didn't leave. She walked further into the room, a blurred figure in the mist, a ghost in silk. I heard the soft thud of heavy fabric being placed on the vanity. Then the rustle of clothing. Then the distinct, terrifying sound of the toilet lid being lowered. She sat down. "What are you doing?" I asked, the water suddenly feeling not hot enough to protect me. My voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual authority. "Talking," she said. "The acoustics are better in here, and I like the fog. It levels the playing field." "That was the deal," I reminded her, gripping the edges of the tub underwater. "The deal is evolving," she murmured. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the dark smudge of her hair and the pale curve of her throat. But I could hear the shift in her tone. It dropped an octave, becoming sultry, a low frequency that vibrated through the water itself. It was confessional, intimate, dangerous. "I tried to write this morning," she admitted. "After the kitchen, after I touched your hand. I sat at my desk for 2 hours, staring at the rain. Do you know what I wrote?" "A scene about a storm," I guessed, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "No. I wrote 3 pages about the way a pulse jumps in the hollow of a throat when someone is startled. Your throat. I wrote about the specific thermodynamics of skin contact. I wrote about the way you hold a coffee mug like it's the only solid thing in the universe. The water was cooling, but my skin burned. This was dangerous territory. This wasn't observation. This was fascination. You're distracted," I said. "The muse is supposed to inspire, not interrupt." "You are an interruption," she whispered, her voice cutting through the steam like a knife. "You are a catastrophic interruption. I thought I wanted an anchor, a quiet, static object, but you are not static. You are kinetic energy, and it is becoming difficult. Difficult to write, difficult to think about anything else." The silence that followed was heavy, wet, and pressurized. The steam was starting to settle, the visibility returning in slow, dripping increments. I felt exposed, not just physically, but elementally. I was a scientist who studied storms, and I had somehow wandered directly into the eye of one I couldn't predict. "You should go," I said, the words a weak defense against the gravity of her presence. "I should," she agreed. She stood up, the movement sharp against the haze. "But I don't want to." She lingered at the door, her hand on the knob. "The water is getting cold, doctor. Don't stay in too long. The heat can make you dizzy." The door clicked shut. I was alone again. But the room felt different now. The steam hadn't just obscured my vision, it had clarified the danger. The water was cooling, but the heat in the room had spiked to critical levels. By the third day, the air in the villa had changed state. It was no longer just heavy. It was solid. A pressurized gelatin that made every movement an effort. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified, sealing the windows with a gray, watery film that turned the library into a submarine vessel. I was at my station, attempting to calibrate a humidity sensor that had no business being indoors, when Sydney threw her fountain pen across the room. It hit the far wall with a sharp crack, leaving a tiny splatter of black ink on the wainscoting, like a gunshot wound. "It's useless," she announced, massaging her right hand. She stood up, pacing the length of the Persian rug, her movements agitated, feline. "My hand is cramping. The flow is wrong. The connection between the brain and the ink is severed." I watched her, wary. "Do you want ice? I have a chemical pack in my kit." "I don't want chemistry," she snapped. Then she stopped, turning to me with a look of sudden, dangerous inspiration. "I want mechanics. You. You can type faster than I can write. You have those efficient, scientific fingers." "You want me to take dictation?" I asked, skepticism heavy in my voice. "I want you to be the conduit," she corrected. "Sit at my desk. Open a fresh document. I'll speak, you transcribe. Maybe if I see the words in your font, on your screen, they'll become real." I should have said no. The boundaries of our contract were already blurring, dissolving like sugar in hot tea. But the command in her voice triggered a reflex I hadn't known I possessed. I stood up. I walked to the other end of the long mahogany table. I sat in her leather chair, which was still warm from her body, and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on the blank white page, a rhythmic, waiting heartbeat. "Ready," I said, my fingers hovering over the keys. Sydney didn't sit. She moved behind me. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence like a heat source, radiating against my back. She began to pace, a slow pendulum rhythm behind the chair. "Chapter 4, she began, her voice professional, detached. The storm had isolated them for 48 hours. The house had become a world entire, a closed system of thermodynamics and desire." I typed the words. Thermodynamics and desire. My throat went dry. "She sat at the desk," Sydney continued, her voice drawing closer, trying to maintain the fiction of her composure. She told herself she was there for the data. She told herself she was an observer. But she could feel the other woman standing behind her, could feel the precise distance between her spine and the other woman's body. My fingers faltered on the keys. This wasn't her novel. This was a transcript of the room we were currently breathing in. "Keep typing," Sydney commanded softly. "Sydney, type." She could feel the heat, she dictated, and now her voice was right at my left ear, a warm breath that sent a shiver racing down my vertebrae. It wasn't a passive heat. It was an active, seeking thing. She realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she didn't want to be safe anymore. She wanted the storm to break in, I typed. The keys clicked, loud and percussive in the silence. She wanted the storm to break in. The words appeared on the screen, an indictment of my own internal state. Sydney moved to my right side, leaning down, her hands bracing on the edge of the desk on either side of my laptop. She had trapped me within the circle of her arms without actually touching me. I could smell the ozone on her skin, heavier now, mixed with the scent of rain. "Write this," she whispered, her voice dropping into that sultry lower register that bypassed my brain and went straight to my blood. The author leaned closer. She watched the other woman's hands tremble over the keys. She saw the flush rising on her neck, a map of vulnerability that no satellite could track. She wondered what would happen if she stopped writing the scene and started living it. My hands were shaking. I could see them trembling against the black plastic of the keys, betraying me, just as she had described. The line between what was happening and what I was typing had vanished. The fiction had eaten the reality. She wondered, Sydney dictated, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel the shape of the words against my skin, what the scientist would do if she reached out, if she crossed the line of the contract. Would she run? Or would she finally admit that the observation was just a way of touching without hands? I couldn't type it. My fingers froze. The cursor blinked, tick, 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 mocking my paralysis. The tension in the room had spiked beyond anything measurable. I was burning up, consumed by the proximity of her body, by the precision of her voice stripping away my defenses, layer by layer. I can't, I whispered, the words barely audible. I can't type this. Why not? She murmured. Because it's not a story anymore. I took my hands off the keyboard, dropping them into my lap to stop the shaking. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of the unwritten sentence. Sydney stopped pacing. The movement behind me ceased. I held my breath, waiting for the reprimand, for her to scold me for stopping. Instead, I felt the weight of her hand settle onto my shoulders. Firm, possessive, real. Good, she said, her voice vibrating through my bones. I was hoping you'd say that. Good, she had said. And then the universe punctuated her sentence with a catastrophe. It wasn't a flicker. It was a sudden, violent death of the grid. Somewhere in the valley, a tree had finally won its war against a power line, and simultaneously, the generator in the shed gave a wet, mechanical cough and died. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of my server, the low buzz of the lamps, every frequency of modern life was severed in a single heartbeat. We were plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt heavy, like deep water. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, broken only by the wind screaming against the stone eaves. I felt Sydney's hands tighten on my shoulders for a fraction of a second before she let go. The loss of contact was more disorienting than the blindness. Don't move, she said. Her voice came from the void, stripped of its usual command. It sounded smaller, human. The furniture in here is treacherous in the dark. I have a tactical light in my kit, I said, my voice sounding too loud in the sudden quiet. No, she countered quickly. No LEDs, no harsh beams. There are candles in the kitchen, top drawer, left of the sink. Matches are on the mantel. I moved by instinct, my hands mapping the invisible geography of the room. I traced the edge of the mahogany table, the rough spine of a leather chair, the cool slide of the wall. My other hand found her arm in the dark. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, then settled, her muscles tense under the silk. I didn't let go. I used her as the waypoint, guiding us both toward the hearth. I found the matchbox by touch. The strike was loud, a sharp rasp, followed by a flare of chemical brilliance that smelled of sulfur and heat. For a second, it illuminated Sydney's face, eyes wide, pupils blown black, the mask of the author completely gone. She looked young. She looked terrified. We lit the candles. One by one, small constellations of fire bloomed in the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The sharp, clinical edges of the library softened into amber pools and long, wavering shadows. The room felt smaller, archaic, a space out of time. Sydney sat on the rug, pulling her knees to her chest. The candlelight caught the gold in her eyes and the softness of her mouth, smoothing away the sharp angles of her persona. In this light, she wasn't the literary giant who intimidated critics. She was just a woman, watching the storm try to dismantle her home. I checked the barometer before the lights died, she whispered, staring at the flame. The pressure is rising. The system is breaking up. It happens, I said, sitting beside her, watching the way the light played on her skin. Entropy. All storms end, the energy dissipates. I know. She looked at me then, and the expression on her face broke something in my chest. But I find myself afraid. Of the dark? Of the light, she corrected. Of the morning. Because when the rain stops, the bridge becomes passable. The road clears. And the Muse packs her equipment and leaves. I looked at the shadows dancing on the wall. I looked at my dead laptop, a black mirror reflecting nothing but the candlelight. A week ago, that screen was my lifeline. Now, I realized with a jolt that I hadn't checked the wind speed in 12 hours. I didn't care about the grant or the publication or the safety of the known world. The bridge is just concrete, I said softly. It doesn't dictate where I go, doesn't it? She reached out, her fingers hovering near my hand on the floorboards, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. You are a scientist, Doctor. You follow the logic. The logic says you leave when the variable is resolved.
Maybe the variable has changed, I murmured, my heart hammering against my ribs.
Maybe the data is flawed. The wind howled outside, a final, desperate protest against the coming calm. But inside, the decision had settled in my chest like a stone. I wasn't waiting for the rain to stop anymore. I was praying for it to flood.
The silence woke me.
It wasn't a gentle waking. It was a violent, sudden vacuum. The container had shattered. I opened my eyes. The light was offensive. It streamed through the gaps in the curtains, sharp and unfeeling. It was the color of reality. I lay there for a long moment, listening for the rain, for any excuse to stay. But the roof was silent. The storm had died, leaving a blinding, terrifying clarity in its wake. I walked to the window. The valley was painfully bright. The sky was a bruised but clearing blue, and the river was receding. And there, in the distance, I saw it. The bridge. Damaged, covered in silt, but standing. Passable. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It's over. I heard a bird singing, a single, idiotic robin chirping from the oak tree, oblivious that the world had ended. The sound was jarring. It was the soundtrack of normalcy, and I hated it. I began to pack. My movements were mechanical, the muscle memory of 100 field expeditions taking over. I coiled the cables, feeling the plastic bite into my skin. I dismantled the server stack. It felt like disassembling a bomb that hadn't gone off. Every object I placed in my duffel bag felt heavy, like I was packing stones. The zip of the bag closing was a harsh, final sound, a punctuation mark I didn't want to write. I walked downstairs. The house felt different in daylight. The shadows that had held us, the candlelight that had softened the edges of our contract, were gone. The library was just a room with too many books. The kitchen was just a place to make coffee. The magic of the isolation had evaporated. Sydney was standing in the foyer. She was dressed, not in the silk robes or the soft layers of the storm. She wore a structured blazer, dark jeans, boots. She looked armored. She looked like the author on the book jacket again. Distant, formidable, complete unto herself. She was looking at the door, not at me. The river crested at 4 a.m., she said. Her voice was flat. The bridge is holding. The road crews are already clearing the mudslide. I saw, I said. My voice sounded rusty. I tightened my grip on the bag. The model was accurate. The high pressure moved in. The rain stopped, she stated. 3 words. But between us, it was a legal decree. Stay until the rain stops. That was the deal. I looked at her, searching for the woman who had whispered dictation into my ear, who had admitted fear in the candlelight. But the light was too bright. She stood with her hands clasped, the perfect picture of a host bidding farewell to an inconvenient guest. Well, I said, I should go. I have data to upload. Of course. You have your work. And you have yours. The silence is back. Yes, she said. I can write now. I took a step. My boots on the marble sounded loud, echoing in the vast space. Every step felt wrong. It felt like walking off a ledge. It felt like an amputation. My body screamed that the magnetic north was behind me, standing by the staircase. But logic said go. Leaving would restore the status quo. It would put me back in the safe, lonely world of predictable outcomes. It was the rational choice. And it felt like tearing stitches out of a wound that hadn't healed. I reached the heavy oak door. I put my hand on the cold iron latch. I paused. The metal bit into my palm. I waited. For what? For thunder? For the bridge to collapse? The silence stretched, thin and brittle as glass. Goodbye, Sydney, I whispered. I pressed down on the latch. The mechanism clicked open. The mechanism disengaged with a solid metallic thunk. But the door didn't move. It wasn't stuck. The hinges were well oiled. The wood wasn't swollen. The resistance wasn't mechanical. It was internal. My hand was paralyzed on the cold iron, the muscles locking up in a rebellion that my brain couldn't override. I stood there, staring at the grain of the wood, breathing in the scent of rain-damp air leaking through the crack, and realized that walking out that door wasn't just leaving a house. It was an act of violence against my own nature. The air behind me was a physical weight. Sydney was waiting. She was waiting for the sound of the door opening, for the sound of my boots fading down the drive, for the return of her solitary, controlled universe. Or maybe she was waiting for something else entirely. I took a breath. It shuddered in my chest, ragged and uneven. Then I let go of the latch. I turned, slowly, against the logic of self-preservation. Sydney hadn't moved. She was standing exactly where I'd left her, framed by the archway of the library, the morning light hitting her face in a way that should have revealed every flaw, but only highlighted the devastating clarity of her expression. She wasn't looking at the door anymore. She was looking at me. And the look wasn't resigned. It wasn't the polite farewell of a host. It was a challenge. It was the same look she'd given the storm when she opened the gate, unflinching, terrified, and hungry. "You didn't push," she said. Her voice was quiet, carrying across the marble foyer without effort. "No," I admitted. "I didn't." "The rain stopped, doctor. The data says it's safe." "The data is incomplete." I let my duffel bag slide from my shoulder. It hit the floor with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. I didn't care about the equipment inside. I didn't care about the sensors or the hard drives or the carefully gathered evidence of the storm. I only cared about the distance between us. I crossed it. I walked back toward her, my boots loud on the stone, closing the gap that we had spent 3 days carefully maintaining and carefully breaching. I didn't stop at the polite social distance. I didn't stop until I was standing inside her personal gravity, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her irises, close enough to smell the sandalwood and the lingering scent of old paper. "I lied," I whispered. The air between us was electric, charged with a voltage that made the hair on my arm stand up. "About the bridge?" she asked, though she wasn't looking at the bridge. She was watching my mouth. "About the observation," I said. "I wasn't just tracking the storm, Sydney. I wasn't just looking for the eye of the hurricane to find the quiet. I stopped checking the radar 2 days ago. I wasn't looking at the weather. I was looking at you." Her breath hitched, a small, sharp sound that cracked the armor of her composure wide open. "And what did you find?" "That you're the only thing that makes the noise stop." She didn't answer with words. She reached out, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with restraint, and grabbed the lapels of my jacket. She pulled. The kiss wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question or a test. It was a collision. It was 3 days of repressed tension, of stolen glances in the library, of accidental touches in the kitchen, of whispered dictation in the dark, all detonating at once. It was a crash. It was violence and relief tangled together. I buried my hands in her hair, ruining the severe style she'd adopted for her return to the world, pulling her closer until there was no air left between us. Her mouth was soft, urgent, demanding. She kissed like she wrote, with precision, with an understanding of pacing, with a devastating intent to unravel the narrative I had built around myself. There was no pretense in this kiss. There was just the visceral, undeniable fact of her body against mine. The taste of her was better than the silence. It was better than the storm. It was the only data point that mattered. She made a low sound in her throat, a vibration that traveled straight through my chest and pressed me back against the wall. Her hands were everywhere, on my neck, my waist, tracing the line of my jaw, mapping me not for a character study, but for herself. The fiction dissolved. The contract burned up in the heat of the contact. When we finally broke apart, gasping, forehead resting against forehead, the world had rearranged itself. The sunlight was still streaming in, the bird was still singing, but the axis had shifted. "You're not leaving," she whispered, her eyes dark and blown wide. "No," I said, my voice wrecked. "I'm not." I pulled away from her, just for a second. I walked back to the heavy oak door. I didn't open it. I reached for the deadbolt, the heavy iron bar that sealed the villa against the world. I slid it home. Clang. I locked us in. Not because of the rain. Not because of the bridge, but by choice. I woke to a different kind of light. It wasn't the bruised, gray illumination of the storm, nor the harsh, blinding glare that had tried to chase me out the door yesterday. This light was gold. It poured through the east-facing windows of the master bedroom, pooling on the duvet like spilled honey. It was quiet. For the first time in a week, My internal barometer wasn't tracking pressure drops. I lay still, cataloging the new data. The high thread count of the sheets, the scent of her skin settled deep into the pillows, and the weight of an arm draped over my waist. Sydney was asleep. The sharp-eyed author was gone. In her place was a woman with messy hair and a relaxed jaw, breathing deeply against my shoulder. I watched her. I observed the rise and fall of her chest, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheekbones. It was the only observation I wanted to make. I didn't want to write it down. I just wanted to memorize it. She stirred, sensing the shift in my attention. Her eyes opened, slow, hazy, unguarded. There was no confusion, no panic. She just tightened her arm around me, pulling me closer into the warmth. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. "I locked the door," I reminded her. "Remember?" "I remember." She smiled. And it wasn't the predatory smile of the library. It was soft. I was afraid I'd dreamed it, that I'd wake up and find the guest room empty and the Jeep gone. "The Jeep isn't going anywhere," I said, tracing the line of her collarbone with my thumb. I have a lot of vacation time stored up, and the university doesn't care where I process the data, as long as the models get built. I can set up a remote station in the garden. She propped herself up on one elbow, the sheet falling away. "You'd stay? Here? With me?" "The microclimate requires further study," I teased gently. Sydney laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated in the quiet room. Then she grew serious. She looked at me with that familiar intensity, but the wall was down. "The book," she started, then hesitated. "The writer's block. It wasn't entirely about the words. I told you I needed an anchor, but I didn't need a character study. I needed to remember what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't trying to take something from me. I was lonely, Doctor. The silence had become too loud. You took plenty," I countered. "You stole my posture, my nervous tics." "I was trying to keep you," she admitted. "I thought if I wrote you down, I could make you permanent. But the paper version is cold. This," she pressed her hand against my chest, right over my heart. "This is better." "It is," I agreed. We lay there for an hour, letting the morning sun burn off the last lingering shadows of the week. We talked, not about storms or plot structures, but about small, real things. Coffee orders, sleeping habits, the way the light hit the dust motes dancing in the air. It was domestic. It was easy. It was the calm after the hurricane, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full. Eventually, the pull of the day became unavoidable. "Coffee," Sydney announced, sitting up. "Real coffee this time. No accidental collisions." "I liked the collisions," I said. "Oh, the collisions are staying," she promised, leaning down to kiss me. Slow, lazy, possessive. "But the awkwardness can go." We went down to the kitchen together. The routine was the same. The grinder, the French press, the waiting. But the context had been rewritten. I didn't stand on the other side of the island. I stood next to her, hip to hip, watching the garden dry out in the sun. The storm was over. The rain stopped. But looking at Sydney, I knew the real story was just beginning. Time didn't just pass. It settled over the valley, like the silt after a flood, rich and transformative. The seasons turned the view from the library window, from the bruised purple of that first storm, to the blinding green of spring, then the burnt gold of autumn. My Jeep never made it back down the mountain, not permanently. It sits in the drive next to Sydney's sleek sedan, covered in a fine layer of pollen or snow, depending on the month. I did set up the weather station. It stands in the rose garden, a sleek spire of aluminum and spinning anemometers rising amidst the wild, thorny overgrowth. Sydney calls it my totem. I call it necessary context. I still track the pressure drops, the wind shears, the incoming fronts, but I don't chase them anymore. I don't need to drive into the throat of the gale to find the quiet. I find it every morning when I wake up in the east bedroom. I find it in the sound of Sydney's pen scratching across paper, a sound that used to make me feel like a specimen under a microscope, but now just sounds like the heartbeat of the house. The book arrived on a Tuesday, 2 years after the flood. It came in a heavy cardboard box, smelling of fresh glue and anticipation. I found Sydney in the kitchen, staring at it, afraid to break the seal. She had spent months wrestling that manuscript into submission, pulling the chaos of our week into a narrative the world could understand.
"You do it," she said, sliding the box toward me across the marble.
I cut the tape. I pulled out the hardcover, feeling the substantial weight of it in my hands. The jacket was dark, a storm-tossed landscape that looked suspiciously like the view from the library window during the power outage. I didn't look at the plot summary. I didn't check the reviews. I opened the cover to the dedication page. There, in the center of the stark white paper, were 2 lines. To the scientist who brought this and stayed for the quiet. I looked up at her. She was leaning against the counter, watching me with that same intense, unflinching gaze she'd had the first day she opened the gate. But the hunger in it had changed. It wasn't a hunger for a story anymore. It wasn't the predatory look of an author needing a muse. It was just love. It's not nonfiction, she warned softly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I took liberties. The ending is happier than real life usually allows.
"Real life is catching up," I said, closing the book and crossing the kitchen to kiss her. We stood on the porch later that night. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and wet earth. The sky to the west was lighting up, purple and violent, another supercell forming over the ridge. The old me would have been calculating wind speeds, checking the bridge integrity, planning an exit route. But as the first roll of thunder shook the ground, vibrating up through the soles of my boots, I didn't move. Sydney stepped up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder. I leaned back into her warmth. The wind picked up, whipping her hair across my cheek, howling against the stone walls. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was dangerous. "Big one," she murmured against my ear. "Massive," I agreed. We didn't go inside. We stood there and watched the lightning tear the sky open, unafraid of being trapped. Because we weren't trapped. We were held. The rain stopped eventually, of course. All storms run out of energy. But the story we started in that library didn't end with the weather. It turns out that sometimes the most dangerous storms aren't the ones that destroy your house. They're the ones that rearrange your life so completely that you can never go back to who you were before. The bridge was fixed, but I never crossed it. If you've ever found your calm in the middle of a storm, subscribe for more stories like this.